Julia Handl to this Original Thinking lecture. Now, this Original Thinking series is an opportunity for us in the business school to welcome new and newly promoted colleagues and to celebrate their successes. During the pandemic, they have provided us with an opportunity to connect with colleagues and to support one another, as well as sharing our research with a global audience. And talking about a global audience, over 300 people have registered for today's event. And we're doing a lot more live streaming on LinkedIn, on Facebook and other things. And it's really amazing to think that we have got this international audience here joining us today. And that must be testimony to Julia's standing in the field. So it is very pleasing as we move to this hybrid format, and it's really nice to see so many of you here in the room today, that we are welcoming an in-house audience as well as this online audience this afternoon. Now, Julia is a member of the Decision and Cognitive Sciences Group and the Management Science and Marketing Division here at Alliance Manchester Business School. Her expertise lies in the areas of optimization, data mining, and machine learning. Interdisciplinary research excites Julia, and she has spent time in all three faculties at the University of Manchester. She must be one of the few people that's done that, so it's quite an achievement. But that is testimony to the broad applicability of the techniques she works with and develops. Before joining Alliance Manchester Business School, Julia was a Medical Research Council Special Training Fellow in Bioinformatics in the Faculty of Life Sciences here at the university. And I've spent 6 months as a visiting researcher at the University of Washington in Seattle. She holds a PhD degree from the University of Manchester, a master's degree from the University of Nuremberg, and an honours degree from Monash University. So she certainly taught the world as well when she collected her qualifications. Julia has been awarded funding by the Medical Research Council and the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and has hosted a number of postdoctoral fellowships at the school. More recently, and in collaboration with industry partners, she has been awarded Turing projects looking at community detection in bipartite networks and graph neural networks. Julia has been an Alan Turing Fellow since 2018, an appointment which has just been renewed. And she has been on the management board of the university's Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence since its inception. So this afternoon, Julia will discuss the range of trade-off solutions and how they are used for machine learning problems. As humans, we are forced to make trade-offs in virtually every decision that we make. Trade-offs which can sometimes involve conflict and which therefore sometimes make it difficult to make sound decisions. In exactly the same way, trade-offs also exist in the use of machine learning applications, where models have to strike a compromise between a variety of conflicting criteria. So Julia is going to discuss with us those trade-offs and conflicts and compromises that get made during her lecture. So there's going to be plenty of time towards the end of the session for your questions. That's when we have a great question and answer session. If you're in the room, which you are here, of course, you can raise your hand and we'll come to you in turn. But if you're watching online, please type in your questions into the chat function, and we will work through them also in the event, during the event. And we have a colleague here in the room who's going to be posing the questions to Julia as we go along. So this is our bit of experimentation as well, and I'm sure it's going to work. So Julia's discussion, the discussion after her lectures and questions will be facilitated by our business engagement lead and senior lecturer in decision sciences, Richard Almendinger, who many of you, of course, already know as well as Julia. So I'm sure you're keen to get started. So on that basis, let me hand over to Julia, and thank you very much for what will be an exciting lecture.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Fiona, for your very kind introduction, and thank you all for attending. I'm particularly excited to be able to deliver this lecture with an actual physical audience after such a long time of online teaching. It's really nice to actually stand in a lecture theatre. The title of my talk today is Multi-Criteria Optimization and Decision-Making in Machine Learning, and that is a bit of a mouthful. So I've not just put one piece of jargon in that title, but 3 of them. So I'm particularly grateful that you came and attended the lecture despite all that jargon. And to pay back that trust, I'm going to do my very best to not become too technical in my lecture. I've tried to keep things at quite a high level, but I'd be very happy to follow up, to answer any technical follow-up questions in the Q&A session later. So, what am I trying to achieve in my lecture today? So essentially, what I'm hoping to do is to convince you of 3 points. The first one is that problems with multiple criteria are everywhere. Some of you might be aware of that. Some of you might not have rationally thought about that in a lot of detail. To then move on to the claim that multi-objective and multi-criteria optimization is equally relevant in machine learning. And then finally, as my third point, to convince you that we now have a number of examples that illustrate and highlight the strengths that multi-objective and optimization and multi-criteria decision-making can bring to the area of machine learning. And I'll use 2 examples of the area of unsupervised learning in my own research. And don't worry if you don't know what unsupervised learning is, I'm going to explain that in due time. Okay, so let's start with the first of these. Problems with multiple criteria are everywhere. And to get us started in thinking about that, I just wanted to highlight the fact that we all take multiple decisions that involve multiple criteria on a daily basis. And most of the time when we take those decisions, we won't even be consciously aware of the fact that we're doing that. Yeah, so let's start with a very simple example that illustrates that. So most of us, including me, are probably going to go home at some point after the reception tonight, and we'll want dinner. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to cook that dinner myself. So I'm going to have to think about what to cook. And it's midweek, so my fridge is probably not in its most promising state. But I might be able to produce a number of alternative options that I can think of. Yeah, so in this case, I think I might have enough ingredients to make lasagna. I could make pasta with tomato sauce. I could cook a fish with some salad. Or I could just open the freezer and make a pizza. Yeah, those are my choices. These are my possibilities at this point in time, given the state of my fridge. So how do I go about making decisions about what I'm going to prepare for dinner? Well, to do that, I really need to know what are my objectives, what are my criteria. And let's say I've got 2 primary criteria. Now, I'm going to be tired tonight, so I want the preparation effort to be limited. Yeah? So the amount of time it takes to prepare that meal is one of my criteria. The second one is the healthiness of the food. And I'm drawing these 2 criteria on separate axes because they're not very easily put on a single scale. Because one of these, the preparation effort, I can quantify that in terms of time. The other one, the unhealthiness of whatever I'm cooking, I can only quantify that in a very vague manner, maybe in terms of long-term health outcomes. But it wouldn't be very easy to say how I could put that, how I could measure performance across both of those criteria and put that on a single scale. So if we're now thinking about our food in this, in the context of these 2 criteria, yeah, then maybe my pizza is somewhere up here. So that's going high on the unhealthiness scale, but it's very quick. The pasta is doing a bit better from a health point, but also I need to actually put in a little bit more effort. Not much, but more than taking a pizza out of the freezer and shoving it in the oven. The salad and the salmon, tempting as it might be, it's the most preparation effort out of my options here. And then I've got the lasagna, and I'm talking here about a fresh-made lasagna. That's slightly less healthy than the fish and salad option, and unfortunately it involves a lot of work. And so now that I know how my options score on these 2 criteria, how can I now make rational decisions here? So there's 2 key things that we can actually see from this analysis. The first one is that I shouldn't make lasagna. Because lasagna is clearly a worse choice than my fish. Yeah, because we can see that the fish does better both in terms of the health benefits and in terms of the preparation effort required. So if I design and cook the lasagna, then from the perspective of these criteria, I'll be making a mistake. That's a poor choice. It's not really supported by this analysis. So that's point number one. The second point we can take from this is that for the other three options, it's really difficult to make a choice because all three of these present optimal trade-offs between our two criteria. And what I mean by that is we can't switch from one of these choices to another and simultaneously improve on both criteria. We're going to get better on one and get worse on the other. And that's why we call these solutions optimal trade-off solutions, or another term I'm going to use later on is Pareto optimal set. So this is the set of solutions which you're choosing from. And within that set, without any additional information, we can't really argue about which one is the best solution. Now, one thing that's obvious here is that to make a choice, we need to consider additional preferences. And some of these preferences will be specific to individuals. So, for example, my 15-year-old son is cooking dinner probably right now for himself, and I'm pretty sure he's going to go for the pizza option. And similar even for myself, so I might be making a particular decision this evening, but on a different weekday, I might have made a different choice because on that particular weekday, actually my preference might differ depending on the circumstances. Yeah, so for example, my preference system on a Sunday might actually look different than my preference system during a working day. So that's the important thing really, that in order to decide between those solutions, we need to consider additional information which is subjective. Now that's no longer objective, but then very specific to the preferences of an individual or of a particular situation. So that was a very simple example, but hopefully introduced you to some of the key concepts we're going to be using today. Yeah, and just to show you that I don't spend my time analysing my dinner choices, and I would be very unpopular with my family if I did so, I just wanted to show you that you all also are familiar with multi-criteria decision-making, much more complex situations. Yeah, and in fact, that's where having this analytical way of analysing the problem actually becomes powerful. So the importance of it increases with the complexity of the situation we're looking at and with the stakes of the decision that we're looking at. Yeah, and so we can actually, in the press, we can see lots of examples of multi-criterion decision-making around the pandemic. Yeah, so some of those choices were trying to trade off very difficult factors and factors that are very different and so are very difficult to put on a common scale. And one of the most recent decisions that I actually find particularly interesting from that perspective is the decision about vaccinating 12 to 15-year-olds. Yeah, what I find interesting about that decision is that actually there was a sequential decision-making process where we first had a committee that specifically and very explicitly looked at one particular dimension of that decision. Yeah, so the JCVI made it very explicit that they were looking at the direct health benefits and risks of the COVID immunization amongst that age group. And they then passed that decision over to another committee, the medical chief officers, for them to integrate additional criteria into the analysis. One of the interesting things that also happened during that decision-making process, that actually a new alternative was explored as a part of that decision-making. So instead of it making it a binary true-false choice of vaccination versus not vaccination, what the medical chief officers ended up recommending was a compromise solution consisting of a single shot at this point in time. Yeah, so by exploring these trade-offs and understanding that tension between these different criteria, we might actually find different solutions that could suit us better. Okay, so I'm not going to have more time in the lecture today to go in detail into the big field of multi-criteria decision-making, and there's very good books and a very long history of research on the topic. But the key thing I want you to understand and take away from that discussion just now is that in these problems, we typically can differentiate between some parts of our model, some parts of our analysis, where we're essentially able to objectively measure things, and then there are elements that are subjective. And being able to differentiate between the objective and the subjective is really powerful. Yeah, it helps us make better decisions, helps us better reflect on how those decisions arise and what kind of levers we can press in changing them. And that's where we come to machine learning. Yeah, so before I start about where I see the analogies to that in machine learning, I need to first of all explain what machine learning actually is. So a generic definition of machine learning is simply that it's trying to draw inferences from patterns in data. And what that means, I'd like to actually illustrate using two examples. Yeah, so there's two subclasses in machine learning, supervised and unsupervised classification. And I will use two examples to introduce both of those. So let's start with unsupervised learning. So let's assume that we have a customer database, and in that database, we have information about the purchasing behaviors of our customers. We might now be interested in identifying groups within that data set that are homogeneous, that are similar, customers that show similar behavior. If we are dealing with that analysis in a way that we're not making any prior assumption about the groups that we're looking for, but we're genuinely just asking what are those homogeneous groups in that data set, then that's essentially a problem of unsupervised analysis. So we're not telling the algorithm what to learn, yeah, we're just telling it to look for the structure in the data. So essentially, we have this box here, X, yeah, where we can call them attributes, we can call them features, or it might even be just a direct measure of dissimilarity between different customers, but we have some form of information that allows us to assess relationships between customers, whether they're similar or dissimilar, and then we can use that to try and find patterns in that data. Now, we could expand that situation. So let's say we still have that same database, but in addition to the purchasing behavior, we now also have concrete information about one particular outcome of interest. So this might be a new product that we've launched, and some of our customers have bought it. And we'd like to be able to predict which of our remaining customers might be interested in buying our product so that we can advertise it to them. Yeah, so this is a slightly different situation. It might sound similar, but the difference is that now we actually actively know what our outcome of interest is. We want to know whether a customer is or is not attracted by that product so that we can target them with a direct marketing campaign. So what we're effectively asking in this problem is, what are the characteristics of customers in this part of the data, X, that allow us to infer, to predict that they're going to be interested in this product? So that's an example of supervised learning. Yeah, so the characteristic is that we have knowledge of our outcome of interest, and what the models try to do is to learn to predict the outcome given just information about X. Because that means we can go into our data set, look at all those customers who haven't bought the product yet, and make predictions about whether they might do so in the future. And then we can take actions on the back of that. Okay, so this is just a summary of what I've just said. I should have fast forwarded. Yeah, so we've got unsupervised and supervised classification, and these are the two core classes of machine learning. There's some nuances to that, but not enough time to go into that today. Okay, so where do multiple criteria arise in these types of learning problems? There's actually a lot of different types of trade-offs that we encounter in machine learning, and some of those are well accepted in the machine learning community. Yeah, so for example, the one that I mentioned down here for the machine learners in the room is the bias variance trade-off, which is discussed in any machine learning lecture. I'm not going to look at those so much today as those first two. I'd like to highlight examples that are slightly different, because this one here is a mathematical problem. The problems in machine learning that I would like to highlight is the fact that any machine learning problem in practice is embedded in business in an application context. Yeah, so we can introduce theoretically what a supervised learning problem looks like, but ultimately, if we want to use it in an application, then we will be using it to solve a problem, typically a decision problem. So in the example of the direct marketing, yeah, our decision problem was to identify those customers who we should like to. And so the problem that our machine learning is embedded in, that domain issue actually usually comes with a number of additional considerations. Yeah, so the machine learning model itself, purely mathematically, all we're trying to do is to explain the data as well as possible. Yeah, so the definitions of what we mean by an optimal model are quite narrow in that context, and they're purely mathematical. They don't consider domain context. Once we have the domain context, it will leave us in a situation where potentially actually we have additional considerations that really matter in how useful a machine learning model will ultimately be. Now, I just wanted to give 2 examples of that. So the first one is, we might have situations in which mistakes that our model is making come at different costs. Yeah, so if we're trying to predict whether a customer will buy or not, we can make 2 types of mistakes. We can reach out to someone who's not actually going to buy, and we cannot reach out to someone who would have bought. Yeah, 2 types of mistakes. And those mistakes might come with different costs. And those costs might be on scales where they're comparable, where we can put down a simple scale, that makes things easy. But if they're not, it makes things trickier. And we're essentially back in the space of multi-criterion optimization. The other trade-off I wanted to highlight is the increasing need for explainability of our models. Yeah, so depending on the application, it's really important that we can explain our machine learning models. And what we mean by that is that we can explain how the model makes its predictions, and also for one specific case, how it's made its predictions. And that's important now simply from a GPDR perspective in a lot of domains, because we have to essentially be able to tell customers why we made a particular decision about them. Just saying the model said so is no longer good enough. And that need for explainability creates tension with what's usually our primary objective in machine learning, which is to optimize performance of those models. Yeah, because, for example, deep learning models are extremely powerful. They tend to generate very good predictions, but they're not very explainable, and that limits the applications. And so none of this is that new. And in fact, experienced machine learning practitioner will be very used to understanding that if you develop a machine learning pipeline for a particular domain, you need to consider some of those constraints, and they will tend to integrate that information during the model selection stage. Yeah, so in choosing between a number of models and possible solutions we might have, we will integrate these considerations. So the premise of what I'm trying to convince you of today is that this stage might be too late. Because essentially what we're doing here is we're generating models using a very narrow mathematical definition of performance and of our criteria. And once we come to model selection, while we're integrating those criteria, it may be too late. We never actually generate those trade-offs that would have been the most interesting. Yeah, so what I've tried to do in my work, and we will talk about some examples of that later, is to move some of that consideration of possible trade-offs from the model selection to the solution generation stage. And one of the things that I think people don't always reflect about is that machine learning, all machine learning, is in some way, implicitly or explicitly, underpinned by an optimization technique. Yeah, we're trying to optimize mathematical fit, if you like. And that's typically single objective optimization. So in order to achieve what we want, which is to create optimal trade-off solutions during the learning process, we need to move from that single objective to optimizers capable of multi-criteria optimization. So this is where optimization comes in. Yeah, so essentially there's a well-established body of literature on optimization methods that can do that, where instead of optimizing a single scalar value, we're essentially optimizing a vector. This looks scary, but this is exactly the same as our food problem before. Yeah, 2 objectives. And what I'm trying to do is no longer find a single optimal solution, but find the set of my 3 optimal meals. Okay, so let me now move on to 2 examples from my previous research where we've tried to put that kind of thinking into practice in a machine learning context, And my focus has been particularly on unsupervised learning problems. So I've selected 2 examples from that. The most important problem in unsupervised learning is cluster analysis. And we've already really discussed what cluster analysis is, because the customer segmentation problem we talked about falls into that remit. Yeah, but just to go over that again, so this is an example of a data set that contains clusters. And remarkably, actually, humans are naturals at this, right? This is a very simple pattern recognition problem for humans. We look at this, and I think we can all agree that the color coding here portrays the correct clusters, the correct homogeneous groups in this data set. Yeah? Unfortunately, what's easy for us in 2D is not easy for machines. Because in order to formulate this as a machine learning model, we need to have a mathematical description of good cluster properties. And there's lots of aspects we take into account when we look at this data. We might be looking at the compactness of these groups. We might be looking at the separation between groups. We might be looking at how consistent my color assignment is with the local densities that I see in this data set. Yeah? But being able to do that effectively, being able to formulate that effectively, is key to get algorithms to work on this data. Now, you might ask, why should I do that if humans are so good at it? Well, there's a simple answer to that. We're good at it in 2 dimensions. And then we're okay at it in 3 dimensions, and then we fail. If we can teach computers to do it well in 2 dimensions, we would hope that that then generalizes to much higher dimensions. So that's cluster analysis. And if we're approaching a problem requiring cluster analysis, so for example, our segmentation problem, yeah, for our direct marketing campaign, one of the first choices we have to make as an analyst is the choice of clustering algorithm we're going to use. And this is a really interesting choice, because I think a lot of people sometimes think that it doesn't really matter and they could just replace one algorithm by another. But the important thing to understand about clustering algorithms is, again, that each one of them is designed to optimize one particular aspect of clustering quality. And so all of these aspects we discussed, compactness, separation, yeah, your clustering algorithm that you select will be trying to optimize a particular criterion or a particular combination of criteria. Yeah, but it will be optimizing that as a single weighted sum combination. And so what we effectively do when we select a clustering algorithm is the same thing that we do when we're eliciting preferences in decision making. We're essentially making a decision about what our preference system looks like for this particular domain. How important do we think these different mathematical criteria of cluster goodness, what combination do we think is the most important in our domain? And we often do that without much thought and without actually knowing what the alternatives are, how our solutions would change if we didn't do that. Yeah, and just in case you don't believe me that the choice of clustering algorithm really makes a difference, here's a really simple data set. Yeah, 3 clusters, 4 dimensions. And what you can see here in the top left is the correct cluster assignment for this problem. And then what you can see in the other 3 figures are the outputs of 3 different algorithms as I run them from producing 2 clusters to 3 clusters to 4 clusters to 5 clusters. So it's an animated GIF set. That's 2, and then we move to 3, and then we move to 4. And so what you can see is, even on this simple data set, which is not simpler than anything we'd ever want to analyze in practice, the solutions differ based on just that simple choice of algorithm. So what we're actually learning from this cluster analysis is more about our choice of algorithm than about the actual data. So in my work, I've tried to address that by essentially trying to incorporate multiple of these measures of cluster goodness early on during the optimization, so at the stage where we're actually fitting our clustering solution. Yeah, so the idea is that, similar to what we had for our food example, we're getting a range of trade-off solutions, and that's illustrated by this line here. I'm just looking at 2 criteria here that I'm both trying to minimize. And then what we can see is that we will observe different types of cluster solutions at different places in that set. And actually, the partition that humans perceive as the most natural might well be one that lies in the middle here. Yeah? So it's one that's actually a trade-off between those 2 criteria. It's not one of the solutions that maximizes just one of those objectives. So that's what we're trying to achieve there. And then we can look at that and we can compare the output of such an optimizer that optimizes MultiCriteria to algorithms like the popular k-means algorithm that just optimizes a single objective. And one of the interesting things about that is that algorithms that focus on just one of those criteria, not only do they not manage to find the whole range of trade-offs, but also the solutions they find individually may not even be optimal trade-off solutions. So we should actually completely discard them from the analysis. Because once we bring these additional criteria in, these solutions suddenly look very poor. So we have essentially, by using such an algorithm, what we do in a way is we postpone a step of decision making, but we postpone it to a point in time where hopefully we have more information about the impact of our choice to help us choose the best alternative. And there's additional benefits we can get from this. So one of them is that we can potentially learn information from the whole set of trade-off solutions and identify characteristics that are shared across the whole set of optimal trade-off solutions. The other one is that in many machine learning pipelines, we actually use cluster analysis as a first step for further models. For example, forecasting, where different error measures may apply. And so we can use Pareto optimality, so just retaining optimal trade-off solutions, as a way of building an objective filter into our analysis that does not yet introduce bias to the further analysis, subjective bias to the further analysis. Okay, just one more example. So we will stick with clustering, yeah, because I don't have time to do this another problem. We stick with clustering, but another important decision in clustering is often the choice of the data, of the actual attributes or features of our customers that we want to feed into that analysis. And again, that choice is really important, and it makes a real difference to the type of clusters, the type of segments we will end up seeing. So if we go back to our direct marketing example, let's say we have two different sources of information. So we have information about the purchase behavior of that customer, and then we have some generic demographic information about those customers. What we want are segments that are homogeneous in terms of their purchase behavior. But also, if we think about this from sort of the perspective of segmentation and how an effective segmentation works, we also need those homogeneous clusters in some way to link to the actual demographic attributes of those customers, because we want to be able to identify which groups sit in which particular parts of the demographic so that we can target them, yeah, so that we can communicate with them. And this will allow us to generalize. It will allow us to reach people who are not yet in our data set and make inferences about their expected behaviors. So we're in a similar situation as we were with our criteria. So what we have is, if we decide, for example, to just look at these data sets which align with our needs for segmentation to be differentiable and accessible, then we could just cluster on this data set here, and that will give us essentially a data set that looks like what you can see on the x-axis here. And you can see that red and yellow look similar in this example. If you choose the other feature set, we'll get a different ordering, and the similarity relationships change. And therefore, the clustering assignment would also change. Well, you might say, okay, well, but I don't want to do that. I just want to draw a diagonal here and use the sum of the two. And yes, we can do that. We might want to just integrate that into a single feature space and cluster on that. But at that point, we've decided what our weight is. We've decided how important this is relative to this, which is really, really difficult to know a priori, because at that point, we have no information about the amount of conflict in this problem. So what we've tried to do instead is to keep the choice open. So I'm not expecting you to understand this diagram. What I want you to take from this is essentially just that we're moving to an optimization process where we're identifying all possible weights between these two criteria. Yeah, so we're investigating all possible trade-offs. And by doing so, we are avoiding that subjective aggregation step that comes far too early in the machine learning pipeline. That then allows us to actually fully explore the trade-offs, to understand the impact of using one feature space versus the other, or of combining them, which will then hopefully lead to a much more informed decision at the model selection stage, because we've learned a lot more about the consistency between those data sources. Okay, so you'll be relieved to hear that that brings me close to the end of my lecture. So I just wanted to briefly just highlight where I see some of the key opportunities of this approach. So the first one is that I think it's quite important in machine learning, and I see that a lot with my students. It's important to debunk the myth that there's a single optimal solution that you can find. Yeah? So using a multi-objective approach very explicitly debunks that. It shows you that there's various possible model, and identifying the best one requires skill and insight from the analyst about the actual problem they're solving. The second one is that multi-objective optimization really allows us to, at an early stage of the data analytics pipeline, to explore and understand those trade-offs before we make a decision. So it's not about eliminating the decision process, but it's about moving it to a later stage in the analytics pipeline where we have enough information. And the third one is that multi-objective optimization actually provides this formal objective mechanism that we can potentially use as a filtering step for early parts of the pipeline in order to feed models into later predictive parts like forecasting and predictive modeling. So those are my key takeaways, and to put that into the words of other people, so Box famously said that all models are wrong. And what he meant to tell us by that is not to get depressed and do something else, but what he was really telling us is that when we're modeling something, we need to worry and think very carefully about which parts of our model are essential to get right, and to focus on those. And in my view, MCDM, so multi-criterion decision-making and multi-criterion optimization, essentially do that. They allow us to make explicit trade-offs that matter in machine learning problems, in applications where that is the case. So that brings me to the end of my talk. I wanted to finish, but I thank all of my fantastic colleagues in management sciences and marketing, all of my collaborators. I wanted to highlight 3 individuals in particular because they've been instrumental in delivering some of the examples I talked about. Maria, who's now in Mexico, Adam, who's now in France, and Inyao, who's now back in China. I also wanted to thank Jean-Bert, Nikolai, Judy, and Jamie, who've acted very kindly as mentors at various times in my time at AMBS, and I don't think I would be here without them. And then finally, I wanted to thank Richard for agreeing to facilitate the questions today. And with that, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you as well from us academics, and we want to congratulate you that you have managed to become prof. It was a long road, but as Fiona said earlier on, it's a testimony to all the effort, all the contributions you have made to the community and the university. So really well done. And as she said, and in fact, as she started with the presentation, MultiCriteria are everywhere. Yesterday I was thinking, should I shave or not? And I'm thinking, and you can see I went through something in the middle, I shaved a bit. So maybe it was the wrong decision. So we have plenty of questions, I hope, on the online audience. Just fire them up through the chat functions, and people here in the audience, if you have a question, raise your hand. I have plenty of questions, high level as well as technical, but I want to give you guys a chance first. Go ahead, Nikolai.
So, okay, so I was very intrigued by saying that choosing a clustering method, you're actually optimizing one of the characteristics. So is it possible to build like an expert system which will kind of convert the problem into some sort of old-fashioned multi-criteria decision-making problem, where we can say, these are the characteristics I seek, so I value this twice as much as that, so I can pick the right thing early on before starting to build the models and see how they perform.
So I'm not fully sure whether I understand the question, so you have to correct me if I'm answering the wrong question. So you can, so I think what comes closest probably to what you're describing is that what people might do is just simply run several different algorithms and then perform model selection on those. And in that way you get several alternatives, each optimized with respect to different criteria.
Right, yeah, but no, I meant like even before we start running, because you're advocating, from my understanding, to run a bit later.
Yeah.
So to keep these things and keep the options open. Before we start running, we can commit to one of them, because I know K-means is good at keeping this.
Right.
And the other is good at meeting this, and I value the first one more than the second one, so I can go for the K-means. So we can just do it with some explicit knowledge, like rule-based.
Yes, yeah, okay. Now I get your question. Yes, so, I mean, to some extent, probably anyone who has experience of using clustering in practice is their own little expert system. Yeah, so realistically, people will have some understanding of which algorithm might work better in a given situation. Novices don't necessarily have that, but I think anyone who's experienced with the problem would have that insight. I think the difficulty with that is what I was trying to highlight with that shift between the solution generation and the model selection stage. So it's a good approach, right? And it addresses the problem to some extent, because it means that hopefully you're using your previous experience to find a model that aligns well with the requirements of that domain. But it still requires there to be perfect alignment, which is quite a strong assumption. Yeah, and it also actually requires not only domain insight, but also understanding your data without having done a lot of exploratory analysis to a level where you can make that decision. Yeah, that's the other difficulty, because clustering might actually help us learn something about the structure and the data. But it's a chicken and egg problem. How do we learn about how do we make a decision when we still need to learn about the data? And so these techniques can actually help you understand that a bit better first, and then form a decision.
Thank you, Nikolai. Let's take on a question from one of the online participants.
We've got a question from Yeze on Zoom. Would multi-criteria decision analysis be a good way to develop a virtual assistant or online bot to deal with mundane custom interactions online?
It's a very specific question, yeah?
I mean, elements of it potentially, but I think, you know, I mean, I only scrape the surface of multi-criterion decision analysis there. And I think the problem in any automated setting is that you need to arrive at one solution at some point. Yeah, so this is different for machine learning, a setting of a, you know, if you have a machine learning specialist engaging with a problem, there's a human in the loop. So you have algorithms that give you candidate solutions, but then you also have a human capable of decision making who can choose between those. In a chatbot setting, you don't have that human. You need to arrive at a single solution. So multi-criterion decision analysis alone will give you the problem that you're still left with a set of solutions. So what you then have to do is dive into some of the literature on preference elicitation in multi-criterion decision analysis. So you'd have to actually understand the preferences of that particular customer, which will then help you finalize it and narrow it down to a single solution.
It's a good literature to look at. I'm thinking today I'm going to a restaurant and there's so many nice dishes on the menu, you just can't decide which one to pick, yeah? So, but you can only pick one unless you have a big stomach.
And you have to pick the product.
Any questions from here? Go ahead, Heiner.
A similar question. I mean, I guess from your work, from my understanding of your work, rather, you're trying to keep the subjectivity. You know, you try to push that back as far as possible. So the question, where, and obviously you just mentioned that at some point you need the subjectivity, right? So do you know anything about where's the optimal point when subjectivity could come in? I mean, clearly from what you said, it's not at the very beginning. Is it at the very end, or is it somewhere in the middle? Is there any research about that?
I mean, so it's a very interesting question. Let me go back to MCDA first, because so I think you can look at that question in the MCDA context, and you can look at it in the machine learning context. And I mean, the interesting thing, if you look at it from an MCDA perspective, is that, you know, people disagree, and you get three different schools essentially, right? You get people who work with what we call a priori decision making. So you elicit the preference first, and then you optimize. You get people who want to do it a posteriori, so you generate the full set of trade-offs, and then you let the decision maker decide because they have the full information at that point. the difficulty with that is always that it's costly. Right? It's information rich, but it's potentially costly to generate. And that's why we have the people in the middle who do interactive optimization. So what the idea there is that you just generate a small set of trade-offs in the area that you think is probably the most interesting. You present those to the decision maker, and then you allow them to potentially adjust their decision and generate a new set of alternatives. Yeah, so it's a multi-criterion problem because you've got the cost of actually generating all those solutions on one side, yeah, and then you've got the cost associated with making a mistake through an early decision on the other side. Does that help?
Yeah, it's a complex problem.
And I think ultimately in machine learning it's similar. There are applications where this approach will make no sense because especially if you have a time critical application, you don't want to be doing this. Yeah. But for example, if you're doing it at an early stage of exploring a data set, it might help you arrive at good decisions for a final pipeline that no longer needs to use this. So it's got its place, but that's not everywhere.
Thank you. Another questions?
So one from Chandrina, who finds it very challenging to explain the technical terms to business people. How do you handle that? If we give a very high level view of results, then they might not feel the amount of effort and hard work that went behind it. And if they try to make them understand the technicalities, they lose interest.
It's a great question. Yeah.
Well, that's the dilemma I've been battling with for the last 2 days. It's really difficult. I think you've got to start with the high level findings and just hope that people will ask you to go into depths so that you could show that the depth is there.
Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Just wondering if you have like similar dilemmas between optimization and the machine learning. Because if you want to solve a model, so machine learning people view it differently than optimization people. Just wondering if you have any, for example, if you want to solve a machine learning problem, just bringing in from an example from classification. There are certain rules like stopping,
Early stopping?
No, sorry, basically proper scoring rules, sorry. For the classification, if you want to pick your model, you have to use a error rate that's within this score, basically. I was wondering if in the rule of clustering, there's any limiting factor that's difficult to communicate with the optimization side for multiple criteria decision making side.
So I'm not, no, I don't really, the optimization and the machine learning communities, I would say, don't talk to each other that much. They are separate communities. So there's not as much exchange as there should be. I think in principle, anyone who works in optimization is able to understand what machine learning methods do at a very deep level. And potentially, actually, this is going to be a controversial statement, but I think someone who comes from an optimization background might be able to understand those machine learning methods sometimes at more depth than someone who's just had machine learning training. Yeah, because it's a methodology that underpins it. And if you understand it, you can then start to reason about these assumptions that you're actually making in applying a particular machine learning model. I think, yeah, so was that your question really about the difficulty of?
Yeah, I mean, it was just in general, because I found myself in a difficult position to communicate my ideas from optimization to our colleagues from computer science.
Yeah, I mean, communication across subject boundaries is always challenging. I think it just requires a lot of listening and patience with each other. There's no easy shortcut other than talking and learning. But the thing is, it's really enjoyable because every time you do that, every time you work with someone in a different community, you learn, or both of you learn.
And in fact, there's a big effort to get these two keeps the communities closer together. You see more and more conferences that attract people from both communities. So we're breaking the ice. Okay, go ahead.
Sticking with the people element, we've got a question from Gerard. So as we move increasingly to embrace machine learning and algorithms more generally, I worry that analysts unwittingly embed cognitive biases into their decision support systems, which the algorithms then amplify and create rationality facades. How do we mitigate this risk?
That is a very good question and a very difficult one as well. Yes, absolutely, there's that risk, and there's a lot of discussion about the biases of machine learning and systems that have been put out there that incorporate racial biases, all types of human stereotypes. And the idea that machine learning makes things objective is a myth from that point of view, because what machine learning models do is they learn what is in the data that they get. And if that data is human generated, it will contain biases. Yeah, so what's actually become very clear in the last few years, I would say, is that machine learning doesn't remove the problem of bias, it potentially makes it worse because it reinforces what's already there. I wish I had a solution to the problem. I think it's an area that the whole community is very actively looking at. I think the first step is awareness, right? And I think it's important. It's important, obviously, for our scientists who work on developing these models to be very aware of that and question that at all points of model building. But I think the other important element of that is actually awareness of the general public, because one of the things I would say about models in general and maths in general is that, unfortunately, it's a really, really good argument to use. People want to believe you if you can throw maths or model at them, because they're scared by it a little bit, intimidated by it, and so people tend to find you convincing, even if your model is completely useless. Yeah, and that's a danger. And I think the only way of dealing with that is to teach kids already in school a really good critical understanding of maths, and the fact that most form of mathematical analysis makes assumptions and only works within the constraints of those assumptions. Yeah, essentially, it's about critical reasoning in maths in the same way that we teach students critical reasoning in all other areas. But in maths, it's often underdeveloped.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Luis. I work at a financial company in Peru, and we have a lot of experience with. I will have some units that develop optimization models, learning models, in order to increase productivity. So I have a question related with the input. What happens in my country usually is that the behaviors of the client changes very quickly. With anything could happen in the market, so behavior is changing. How does the machine learning approach handle with this constant changes of the behavior of the clients, in this case, in financial industry, because sometimes the development of the model takes some time. So maybe when we finish the model, so the inputs are totally different. So how does, maybe it's a general question, but how does the machine learning handle with this variation?
Okay, another very good question. Let me answer that in two steps. I mean, I think the first thing is that with any machine learning model, there needs to be an understanding that it needs updating. Right? You don't develop a machine learning model and then deploy it for all eternity, because once the data, it depends on the domain, but if it's a fast-moving domain, it will need very regular updating. The other thing I would say is that there are techniques specifically designed to help with situations in which essentially our horizon is very short. Because the problem that puts is if you have a system that's changing very rapidly, then the amount of information that's relevant at any point in time is very small and makes it harder to learn from it. And so the techniques I address are actually, so Niall, who's there on the slide, she was a PhD student here at Alliance MBS, and the work we did together focused exactly on such scenarios. So we were looking at time series forecasting, but in a setting where we have structural shifts in the system. And so we only have a small number of data points that are actually relevant. And what we can do in such a setting or what in the problems we looked at, what we could do there is we had several samples, so several people or entities in our system that we knew were similar. And so we could enhance the prediction strength of our models by actually trying to integrate information across entities, rather than just looking at the data for one individual at a longer period of time. So there are specialist techniques out there to try and address it. I mean, there's only so far you can go.
Perhaps the last question here.
The question it was more extension because we found a very interesting. We did a research with financial companies in the city about the use of machine learning, and one of the most fascinating insights is that neural networks too slow for the speed with which they're talking, and secondly is that everyone is chasing the alpha, that lucrative alpha, and the moment when you introduce something in the marketplace, it changes the dynamics of the marketplace. So a machine learning model is no longer an accurate predictor. So you have another level of dynamics there where introducing a system is actually changing the behavior of that system, so you can no longer accurately predict. So this, what Julia explained, is becoming even more complicated by the feedback which exists in some of these natural systems or electronic trading systems.
Okay, now the last question.
I think we'll have to have a follow-up, Julia, because there's loads of questions on Zoom.
This is great.
I'm looking forward to seeing them.
Question from Darminda. How do you apply the ethics when selecting decision criteria? Is there a way of assessing criteria as part of the multi-criteria optimization process in a similar way to model selection?
I mean, that's a tough one. I'm by no means an ethics specialist, although increasingly it's becoming clear that anyone who works in machine learning should have good grounding in ethics. So it's a bit like the question about bias. It's a really important part. I struggle to think about ethics as a criterion that we want to minimize and maximize, because I would actually, my tendency would be to think of it's either ethical or it's not. So it's more of it's a constraint in optimization speech, right? If the project is not ethical, I don't want to trade that off against something else. I don't want to go ahead with it. So yeah, I think it would be an overkill to make it part of an MCDA problem, because it's got more importance.
This question has come from Darminda from Fujitsu, yeah? Who's our Simon Industrial Fellow, by the way. Yeah? Okay, I want to thank you once again, Julia, and thank you for the effort, and congrats once again, yeah, to becoming a prof. You have managed to.
Yeah, so Julia, that was absolutely fantastic. It's not a field that I know at all, but I was really interested in the whole lecture, and you certainly took me the whole journey. I stayed with it. And I think really one important point that struck me about the question is, how do you talk to businesses about what you're doing? And you said it very simply, you keep it high level, the top points that you want to make, and then you might take those who are interested into the journey of complexity. And I thought that was really beautifully put, and something that we'll think about some more. So thank you, everybody. It's really great, isn't it, to be able to have questions in the room, and then to be having questions coming through all the different social media platforms that we're using to broadcast this event. As is often the case, we will be asking Julia to do a bit more work for us, because we do collect up all the questions that we haven't had the opportunity to answer, or Julia to answer, and use it as an opportunity perhaps to do another session with her before she doesn't know these things yet. And we'll be asking her to blog and so on, but you can get a sense of the interest of what she's doing. It's really, really fascinating. So thank you, Julia, for that work. Just to say, very unusually, we do actually have a second event within the business school tomorrow. Probably just links into issues around business engagement and so on. Slightly different area, and that is we've got Richard Jones coming in. So Richard has just been elevated up to the position of Vice President for Regional Innovation and Civic Engagement, and he's going to be coming in and talking about the levelling up agenda, and that will be particularly interesting again for us in terms of business engagement and the role of the business school in that. But for the moment, let's give Julia another round of applause. Thank you. It was. Richard, you can get the chance to ask
No.
questions.
I can ask you questions.
It was great.
Yeah. Disappointed I couldn't ask.
I know,